Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, Ambassador, thank you all for coming here tonight, and thank you to all of those who are following this event online through live streaming. It's a great pleasure to see all of you tonight in this event of a speech and discussion on 100 years on reflections on Asia Minor. Just some technical points, mainly for those who will be following online. The event will be broadcast live. There will be no Q&A facility, so you will not be able to put questions to the speakers that will be replied by them tonight, but the chat box will be open, and you can post remarks or questions for their attention, and they will be considered by them. A big thank you also to our media partner, Kathimerini, who gave us support for tonight's event and who are indeed leading in the renewed interest of the debate on Asia Minor, the campaign, and related questions. After the event is over, there will be the opportunity for you to chat with people at a small reception that will follow. This is all from me. Thank you very much, and I now give the floor to the Ambassador, Mr. Matthew Lodge.
Not quite as tall as Christos. Thank you, Christos. Εκλεκτοί προσκεκλημένοι κυρίες και κύριοι, αγαπητοί φίλοι, με μεγάλη χαρά σας υποδέχομαι όλους στην κατοικία του Ηνωμένου Βασιλείου και βέβαια στην πρώην κατοικία του Βενιζέλου απόψε. Πόσο μάλλον που η απόψινή εκδήλωση είναι η πρώτη μετά την αναγκαστική διακοπή τέτοιων εκδηλώσεων λόγω της πανδημίας. Ευτυχώς η κατάσταση βελτιώθηκε, οι περιορισμοί χαλάρωσαν, η άνοιξη ήρθε και μάλλον το καλοκαίρι και μπορούμε να ξαναβρίσκομαστε σχεδόν όπως και πριν. Ελπίζω να απολαύσουμε όλη την ομιλία, τη συζήτηση και την ανθρώπινη επαφή που τόσο μας έλειψε αυτά τα 2 χρόνια. I'd also like to say a word about how strange it is, but also what a particular pleasure it is for me to be stood here and to have Sir Michael sat at the table to my left. Because for those who don't know, Athens was my first post as a young diplomat, and Michael was my first ambassador. So it's a shame that Colette is not with us this evening, but Michael, thank you for coming, and thank you for all that you do. A little word about the embassy and the team here, the wonderful team who support me and have supported Michael and all those ambassadors in between. As you know, we've been organising lectures, discussions, and similar events for a number of years, particularly since 2014, on the occasion of the centenary of the beginning of the First World War. The embassy contributed to, or supported a number of events to mark the consecutive anniversaries that followed. To name but a few such actions, we held an event on Skiros in the memory of Rupert Brooke, a poetry competition for young poets on the theme of war, an event in Thessaloniki on the Great Fire of 1917. We supported a big conference on the First World War, again in Thessaloniki, organised by the Aristotle University, and it's a great pleasure to have Professor Stefanidis with us here this evening. And I'm very glad that people were able to cooperate with us on all of those events and actions, and a number of them are with us here this evening, so thank you. In parallel, since 2018, we've held the series of our Venizelos Library talks, and then, mostly online due to the pandemic, our talks to mark the 1821 bicentenary in 2020 and, of course, last year. With the advent of 2022, like our media partner Kathimerini, we as an embassy, and I personally, have been fascinated by and interested to learn as much as we can about the history of the events around 100 years ago. This extremely significant year for Greece and for our understanding of modern-day relations and their historical backdrop. and for the added reasons that, as is so often the case, Britain played a significant part, that one of the great protagonists in this story was the man in whose house we are holding tonight's event, Eleftherios Venizelos, and that, as luck would have it, one of the most prominent researchers and historians of that period, and it's rather strange to say this, but is my predecessor, Sir Michael, who is our main speaker this evening. Our distinguished discussants need no introduction, but I will name them nonetheless. Professors Stefanidis and Ploumidis, Mr. Rizas, Director of the Athens Academy Modern Greek History Research Centre, are widely known for their work on modern Greek history and Asia Minor in particular. And Mr. Iordanidis' columns in Kathimerini, with his frequent references and parallels to the events of the period in question, are regularly read by thousands of readers twice a week. So it is a genuine privilege to be here with such learned and distinguished company. I'd like to close by thanking all of our participants and you, our guests, to note the excellent and invaluable support of Kathimerini, and to wish everybody a fascinating, stimulating, and enjoyable evening. So without further ado, I pass the floor to them and look forward with you all to hearing about 100 years on reflections on Asia Minor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Picking up your reference to Lloyd George, I can't help pointing out that you only have to step just through this door and there's a bust of Lloyd George by an artist called Goscombe John, and it's worth looking at. And in that room also there's a picture of Gladstone as a young man, so that you know the house is full of treasures. Thank you very much to the ambassador and his staff, the British Embassy, especially Christos Psaltis, and fellow speakers, and all of you in the audience, because without the audience, this sort of event wouldn't work, whether they're online or here in the flesh. I think there has been a great outflowing of interest in the Asia Minor anniversary this year, although I had a discussion just now with one of our guests who said she was a bit surprised that there wasn't so much as she had expected. So I don't know which is right, but possibly today's event may help you to judge which is the more accurate view. But I have in mind a mass of materials, new and old, which are being published in various formats, and I'd single out the series of articles in Kathimerini these days about the progress of the campaign in Asia Minor, very interesting accounts by a series of historians putting forward different views of what happened in summer 1921, for example, but also, and even more, a product also of Kathimerini, the republication of the series of booklets entitled E Exodos, a self-explanatory title consisting of testimonies, martyrias, from the various provinces of Asia Minor, edited by Paskalis Kytromilidis. Those which cover all the areas of Asia Minor inhabited by Greek communities are extremely moving, I have found. And these materials show the extraordinary richness of the culture of Asia Minor and the continuing differences and debates over the interpretation of what happened. I've been involved in some of these productions, and I'm looking forward to the exhibition in September, the joint creation of the Benaki Museum and the Center for Asia Minor Studies. which we shall come back to, my wife and I, to see. Many of those present today know a lot more about Asia Minor than I do, and it's partly for that reason that I'm going to concentrate on the British angle and the foreigners more generally, because I feel I have something to say about them, which possibly I wouldn't have to say about the Greek side of events. So, 100 years on, reflections on Asia Minor, the foreigners and their involvement. The setting is Paris in early 1919. The great and the good from many European countries are gathering. President Woodrow Wilson arrives in Paris from the United States with a great team of expert advisors, and he is the hope of a fresh start in international relations. A breath of fresh air in what is seen or would be seen by journalists as the musty corridors of old-time European diplomacy. Not an accurate description of what they were doing in those days, I hope. The event, the Paris Peace Conference, is the culmination of 4 years of war, turmoil, toil, and trouble, involving most of the states of Europe and bringing major social and economic change to the lives of Europe's citizens. Its primary purpose is to make peace with Germany. A subsidiary purpose is to make peace with the Ottoman Empire. Historians recently have seen the years 1918 to 1923 as the war which succeeded the war, or in the words of a recent book, why the First World War failed to end 1917 to 1923. Well, this war that failed to end had many battlegrounds, and one of them was Asia Minor. So I start with Britain, which seems right in this setting. Here we are, have Byron looking down on us, and the whole ambience is British here. David Lloyd George, the Welshman, I'll call him LG, became Prime Minister in 1916 and has dominated British politics since then. He is a Liberal. He presides over a coalition government of Conservatives and Liberals, an unstable vehicle held together by the fact of the war and LG's own talents as a politician. But now, with the war over, and he won the war, he seems all-powerful. Asia Minor is probably not in the forefront of his thinking, but he has consulted with Venizelos, who visited London before going on to Paris for the peace conference, so he is well aware that among the territorial claims that Greece will put forward is Western Asia Minor. He knows and likes Venizelos. For his part, Venizelos sees Britain and her empire as the most powerful among the victorious Allied powers. That may sound surprising, but that was the case, I think. America's time has not yet come. It's to come very soon. But for the time being, Britain sort of rules the roost. And then there's the Americans. There is a question whether President Woodrow Wilson has the stamina to deal with so many messy issues arising in Paris, apart from establishing the League of Nations, which is his great project of prime importance to him. As to France, she has lost many, many more men in the war than Britain. Russia, with her new Bolshevik government, is not present, though what happens in Russia is of great concern to the peacemakers in Paris. In short, Venizelos could be pardoned for believing that Britain can do more or less what she wants in Paris, disposing of territories, supporting or denying national claims. the personalities are going to matter a lot in Paris. The background is this disordered state of Europe. This started for Britain with the outbreak of war, when Britain was jolted out of her traditional arrangements for government and warfare and had to go through a groundbreaking series of social and political changes, which are still continuing after the war. Greece was no less shaken by the war, which led in 19 to the schism or split between Venizelos and King Constantine, that widened until it swept up the entire political and military world, and many ordinary citizens to boot. Armistice Day was November the 11th. Only 2 months later, the conference began. Were the peacemakers in Athens ready for the conference? No. But they knew that speed was of the essence, so they could not delay. Lloyd George saw immediately that for his purposes as peacemaker, he needed a new mandate. He obtained this by holding a general election on the 14th of December 1918, which renewed a coalition government of conservative unionists and liberals who had ditched the former Prime Minister Asquith. So LG had his majority, and for now they depended on him. But the Conservatives were the largest party and could topple him by withdrawing their confidence, should it be necessary. Well, this was not a very comforting scenario for Venizelos, who depended on Lloyd George. But in 1919, Lloyd George seemed all-powerful. He dominated the peace conference. He took with him Andrew Bonar Law, who later became Prime Minister, the so-called unknown Prime Minister, although quite a formidable fellow in his own right, Chief of the Conservatives, and Arthur Balfour, a former Prime Minister himself and Foreign Secretary. Lord Curzon had to stay in London running the Foreign Office, to his occasional dismay, because he couldn't get his hands on what was going on in Paris to the degree that he would have liked. But it was Lloyd George who mattered. As a historian wrote, in practice, LG handled every big question himself, using his colleagues as reinforcement in disputed issues. He had the ability to charm and outwit slower intellects. He showed this in his dealings with President Wilson and with his own colleagues. He treated Curzon shamefully. As to Greece, he had decided long before, when he met Venizelos in London in 1912-13, that Greece was the coming power in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the Near East, and that Greece and Britain could together dominate the Eastern Med to the advantage of both countries. Lloyd George set out some of his war aims in a speech to trade union leaders on the 5th of January 1918. "We are not fighting a war of aggression against Germany," he said. Quite surprising in a way. Not against the German people anyway, that's what he said. "Nor are we fighting to destroy Austria-Hungary or to deprive Turkey of its capital or of the rich and renowned lands of Asia Minor and Thrace." End of quote. Of course, the rich and renowned lands of Asia Minor and Thrace were exactly what Venizelos wanted. But perhaps Lloyd George would change his mind in the interim before it became necessary for him to make up his mind. Who were the foreigners? I started with Britain and Lloyd George because they were the most important of those present at the Paris Peace Conference in relation to Greece. France was on home ground. French losses, as I mentioned, in manpower and economic resources were much greater than the British or American. France was represented at Paris by the elderly Prime Minister Clemenceau, who was chairman of the Peace Conference. His main aim was to secure France's future security from Germany. Then there were the Americans. That meant President Wilson, whose famous 14 points helped to set the agenda of the conference. And Wilson was determined to establish a League of Nations, and he succeeded. But as a negotiator, he proved to be something of an unguided missile. He did not have the staying power of the Europeans. Then there were the Italians. Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando, the fourth of the Entente allies in terms of power. They were, from Greece's point of view, a disruptive element because they opposed Greek claims and positions at every point. I think, Ioannis Stefanidis, you'll be talking about this aspect, so I'm not going to go on longer about that now. Were these big three or four actually in charge? Well, they were in charge of events in Paris, but of course they could not control events throughout Europe, which kept springing surprises and creating problems. They had ample advice at hand in Paris from ministers of foreign affairs, distinguished academics, and a mass of officials and advisors. The United States and Britain were particularly well prepared, but there were problems. First, the national delegations not only disagreed with each other, which was to be expected, they contained disagreements within themselves. Second, the rush of events, the pace of change, political and economic, proved greater than they expected. In an ideal world, they would come together in seclusion and arrive at wise judgments. But the world was not like that. It was racked by local uprisings and wars, strikes, sickness, humanitarian disasters, competition between states, many new states, and factions. And hanging over it all, there was the problem of time, so often a problem in politics. There were too many issues to be resolved in Paris, and postponing one meant losing control of events. This was seen very clearly in the case of Turkey, where failure to make an early peace led to the growth of the Turkish national movement under Mustafa Kemal Pasha. So let's turn to Greece and Turkey. It was the big three themselves, Lloyd George, Clemenceau, Wilson, who took the decision to send the Greek army into Asia Minor in May 1919. If they'd paid more attention to the advice of the diplomats, 3 cheers for the diplomats occasionally, on this occasion anyway, they would not have done so. Against the cautionary advice on the British side from the experts, diplomatic experts, but also a firm negative from the head of the British Armed Forces, Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson, who was later assassinated by the Irish Republican Army outside his front door in London. And this is a reminder, perhaps worth mentioning, that throughout an important part of these events which I'm describing, Lloyd George was ultra concerned with the Irish problem. What's the difference today? None. But there it was in an even more acute form, and it led to the assassination of the Chief of Imperial General Staff. Lloyd George took the lead in getting the mandate for Asia Minor into Greek hands. He took the opportunity offered by the absence of the Italians because of a tiff over Fiume and the Adriatic, which led them to walk out of the conference. So there were only 3 and not 4, the big 3. They were opposed to the Greek claim to Smyrna. and had their own claims to advance. This is the Italians. President Wilson went along with Lloyd George because he was angry with the Italians. It was a pique. It wasn't raison d'etat, it was annoyance. Clemenceau may have seen the landing as risky. He soon had second thoughts about it, but Venizelos had bought his support by his offer of Greek troops to help the French invasion of Ukraine, which turned out to be a fiasco, but it was important at the time to Venizelos' credibility. Why did they do it? In particular, why did Lloyd George do it? He wanted to help Venizelos, and he knew that Venizelos wanted above all to secure Asia Minor for Greece. The serious reason was that having Greece as an ally could help Britain secure her aims in the Near East, police the Aegean Sea, and control the Straits, the Dardanelles, which the British regarded as an essential interest. And it has been argued quite plausibly that that's the most important of the reasons why Lloyd George did what he did. So the big three authorized the Greek occupation of Smyrna. The decision was the crucial first step in what became gradually more and more difficult for the Greek occupiers. First, there was violence at the landing in Smyrna. Then there were tensions between the civil government and the Greek military. And then there were the Turkish nationalists, the irregulars, as well as the government in Istanbul. The Turkish nationalists, who with great difficulty, and we shouldn't underestimate how problematic it was for them and for Kemal, developed their military resources and their grip on Turkey. And then finally, after the Treaty of Sèvres in August 1920, came the Greek elections of November 1920, at which Venizelos fell from power. As to Lloyd George's views, I want to read a page from a diary of someone who was very close to him and calls him D for David. I quote, D, very interested in the Greek advance against the Turks. He has had a great fight in cabinet to back the Greeks, not in the field, but morally. And he and Balfour are the only pro-Greeks there. All the others have done their best to obstruct, and the War Office have behaved abominably. However, D has got his way, but he is much afraid lest the Greek attack should be a failure, and he should be proved to have been wrong. He says that his political reputation depends a great deal on what happens in Asia Minor, though I don't think people care a hang what happens there. But D says that if the Greeks succeed, the treaty is vindicated and the Turkish rule is at an end. A new Greek empire will be founded, friendly to Britain, and it will help all our interests in the East. He is perfectly convinced that he is right over this, and he is willing to stake everything on it. Now that is a diary from Lloyd George's mistress, Frances Stevenson, who was also his personal secretary, very convenient for him and for her. And she later became his second wife, but that's outside the bounds of this talk. And this was in July 1921. So think about that. King Constantine had already come back to Greece and Gounaris was prime minister. So Lloyd George's investment was not simply a matter of his friendship with Venizelos. It was something more than that. And it shows how difficult the issue was politically, a great fight in cabinet, he and Balfour the only pro-Greeks, and so on. So who were these people who were blocking Lloyd George's way? Chief among them was Churchill, who was unstoppable. He'd recovered ground after the failure of the Gallipoli campaign, and he was widely regarded as the most brilliant member of the cabinet, a consummate orator and a writer of great talent, but unreliable. Well, he was now colonial secretary, so he had a legitimate interest in the Asia Minor issue. But in any case, he was never slow to stick his head into other people's business, which he kept on doing throughout his career, including in the Second World War. Well, I suppose it was his business then, but it was also other people's business. In any case, he was never slow to stick his head in, I've said that. Churchill thought that the Asia Minor policy was a serious mistake. Curzon and Balfour were too passive. Churchill wrote to Lloyd George on the 11th of June 1921 that his objective was to make a real peace with Turkey at the earliest possible moment. I entirely disagree, as you know, says Churchill, with the whole policy of the Treaty of Sèvres and the results which have arisen from it. The best evidence for all this going on at this time are the three books written by Lord Beaverbrook, the later mogul of the newspapers, the Daily Express. But he gives very vivid description of Churchill and the rest of them and their disagreements. Another opponent of Lloyd George's policy was Edwin Montagu, the Secretary of State for India, who feared the effect of the war on Muslim opinion. Now that may seem a bit remote from Asia Minor, but it wasn't, because remember we're talking about Constantinople, where there was a great argument going on as to whether to throw Turkey out of Constantinople or to allow the Turks to stay. And the answer was they were allowed to stay, but that was only after a bitter argument in the British cabinet in which Montagu took a leading role. By mid-1921, therefore, Lloyd George's standing in the British cabinet was reduced. With the end of the war, the glue binding the members of the coalition together was loosened, and the issue of how long the government could survive was by 1921 a real one. The Conservatives were getting restless, and in the end, recall, it was his Asia Minor policy that brought Lloyd George down and his government in September 1922 as a result of the so-called Chanak affair, which took place after the successful Turkish attack, which finished off the war with Greece. Let's take a very brief look at the other foreigners, both supporters and opponents of the Greek cause. First and foremost, there's Kemal himself. None of these things would have happened without a leader of extraordinary talent in Turkey. And then there's the United States. Well, Wilson had, to his credit, the League of Nations, but he failed to carry his domestic opponents with him and lost the chance of a united American policy to back his views. Once the peace treaty with Germany was signed and Wilson returned to the United States, the American voice was no longer a truly important factor in the Asia Minor issue. It became clear that there was no hope of persuading the Americans to take on a mandate for Armenia or Constantinople and the Straits. Now France, soon after the Greek landing in May 1919, Clemenceau began to have second thoughts. France acquired in the Treaty of Sèvres a sizable tract of Asia Minor in the east as a zone of interest, but by late 1920 it was clear that that would not work because the Treaty of Sèvres was in the process of being torn to pieces. The return of King Constantine after the November 1920 elections enabled the French to complete their separation from Greek interests in Asia Minor. They found an accommodation with Kemal in the Ankara Agreement of October 1921. Now Italy, which I leave to Ioannis, and now Russia. The most important foreign involvement was the agreement between Kemal's nationalists and the Russian Bolsheviks, embodied in the Treaty of Moscow of March 1921. And this is regarded by Turkish historians, or some of them, as a turning point in the international recognition of Kemal's regime. Like the deal with the French, it brought material advantages to Kemal in the form of arms as well as diplomatic support. So these successive deals made Greece's position more and more difficult. Let me try to conclude. It's important to consider the immensity and the ethnic complexity of Anatolia. Within it, Turks, Kurds, Greeks, Armenians, and others, and at the edges, Russians and others, even before one adds what I have called the foreigners. Of course, Venizelos and Constantine and Gounaris did not aim to totally conquer the whole of Anatolia. That would have been impossible, although sometimes the military came close to setting that as their objective. But as we've seen, it was difficult to avoid being drawn further into the interior, even in the attempt to control the western area of Asia Minor. So the operational area of the Greek occupation was enlarged, with the final enlargement bringing military hopes of a breakthrough, the knockout blow, the sort of fabled knockout blow which proved impossible for the Greek army. Venizelos' mistake, I think, was his rare miscalculation, both of the resilience of Turkey and of the consistency and support of Greece's allies, and also of Greece's economic and political strength. There are papers from October 1919 quoted by Costas Kostis, which make very clear how rocky the Greek economy was by then. Perhaps Venizelos should have paid more attention to Metaxas's views in 1915. I don't know whether that's a controversial view now, but I think it's true. What was Lloyd George up to? Well, he truly believed in the prospects of Greece as a force for good, serving British as well as Greek interests. And he saw an enlarged Greece becoming a significant power on the international stage, able to support British policies and secure the freedom of the Straits. The unknown question is what would have become of the Greek communities of Asia Minor if there had been no Greek occupation. That's not a question I or anyone else can answer, but it's a very interesting hypothetical. The foreigners returned in force to negotiate the Treaty of Lausanne, and some of them were also positively involved in the relief work for the refugees. Lausanne was a success for diplomacy, and though it was a painful experience, it was also a success for Venizelos and Curzon and Ismet. The foreigners were able to lay the foundations of a new settlement in the Near East, and though tested periodically by Turkey, somehow it has survived. So jaw is better than war, as Churchill said. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sir Michael, for a very interesting speech covering the whole gamut of events from the Paris Peace Conference to Lausanne, with some very interesting insights on a number of other issues, from domestic UK politics to domestic Greek politics, in linking things like Ireland and Anatolia in a unique way, I think. Let's now move to Professor Stefanidis, who will speak to us on the Italian factor on Venizelos' policy for Asia Minor.
Thank you, Christos, and thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for inviting me to this event. And let me explain in which capacity I'm here. Unlike my colleagues to the left of me, I have not written an original work on Asia Minor. I have published a chapter for a general work of history in the early 2000s. But I have edited a 3-volume piece of work by Nikos Petsalis Diomidis, titled «Ο Βενιζέλος και η πρόκληση της Μεγάλης Ελλάδος», the first volume of which has appeared in March, published by Niet, and the next 2 volumes hopefully will not be long in appearing. I have edited this back in 2017-18, and what struck me as a historian was the part played by Italy. I mean, there are many factors conspiring or conjuring the Greek claim, the Greek involvement in Asia Minor, the so-called Anatolian venture, but the Italian factor is often overlooked, and it has influenced Greek policy both directly and indirectly. And when I say indirectly, I should mention the expression of the Greek claim as early as the beginning of 1915, the fact that Venizelos elicited the British offer of Asia Minor of considerable concessions on the western littoral of Asia Minor, having in mind, among other things, the Italian claim at the time when Italy was negotiating its entry into the war on the side of the Entente. And he was aware, as early as September 1914, that the Italians were looking to Asia Minor, among other things. So what characterizes Italian policy during that period is a lack of priorities. They were aiming at multiple ends at the same time in the hope that they will succeed to get as much as possible. So they were aiming at the Adriatic, at parts as far as Tyrol and Slovenia. They were aiming at keeping the Dodecanese Islands, and also a sizable portion of Asia Minor. What they got originally by the Secret Treaty of London of April 1915 was a promise of an equitable part of the Mediterranean littoral of Asia Minor around the province of Atalia. So that was the original promise, which did not explicitly include Smyrna, but they were promised the Dodecanese, and they were not promised Fiume, Rijeka. And in the minds of the Italians, Fiume was also to become one of the sacred cows of their negotiating tactics. And it so happened that this promise, the Secret Agreement of London, came 2 weeks after the British reiterated their offer of parts of Asia Minor, which he had originally put to Venizelos in January. They had offered it to the government of Dimitrios Gounaris, and the offer was rejected in practice. So 2 weeks later, they promised that bit to the Italians. The second basis for the Italian claims was an agreement which they reached with their allies, Britain and France, in April 1917, two years after the London Agreement, the so-called Agreement of Saint-Jean-de-Maurienne, which explicitly included Smyrna. But the problem with that agreement was that it was made conditional upon the consent of Russia. And by early 1917, the first Russian revolution had taken place, and shortly after that agreement, the Russian government, the provisional Russian government, denounced all secret agreements. So there was no prospect of the Italians getting what they had originally thought they were promised by that agreement. So when the time for the peace conference came, the Italians based their strategy on these two, and especially on the London Agreement. But they tried to get their partners on the Entente to stick to the spirit, if not the letter, the spirit of the Saint-Jean de Maurienne. So Venizelos had to fight against these hurdles. And an interesting point that Petsalis makes is that in January, February 1917, Venizelos, as head of the provisional government, actually went to Rome and offered to the Italians, especially Foreign Minister Sidney Sonino, Venizelos' άσπονδος εχθρός, I don't know how to put it, implacable enemy. Venizelos, Ploumidis described him as an implacable enemy of Greece. Sidney Sonino, he offered him that Greece renounces her claims on Asia Minor and support for Italian claims along the Adriatic and northern Epirus and the Dodecanese, a couple of islands maybe of the Dodecanese, expecting Italy to support Greece in the case of Western Thrace, not Eastern, Western Thrace, and to give Greece at least 10 of the Dodecanese islands. So that was the offer of Venizelos, and Sidney Sonino, in a fit of arrogance, rejected it. And then came Caporetto, the Italian defeat, and the total Italian dependency on the aid of the Entente powers. So by the time the peace conference began, the Italians suffered from what I might call inferiority syndrome or complex vis-a-vis their major allies. And they negotiated in a wild way. Italian provocations could be called Greece's opportunities. And among those provocations was the practice of sending troops into Asia Minor, beginning in March, April 1919, an act that seriously provoked the British and the French, and was one of the reasons why in early May they decided to let the Greeks into Smyrna. Now, from that point on, the Italians seemed to accommodate themselves to the Greek occupation of Smyrna. Sidney Sonino left office, and his successor, Titoni, made a deal with Venizelos in July 1919, but that deal, like the Saint-Jean de Maurienne agreement, was also made conditional by the Italians, and it was put in the letter of the agreement, upon the fulfillment of Italian claims in the peace treaty. So in case those claims were not completely met, then Italy might absolve itself from that agreement. And Italy actually renounced the agreement on the eve of the Treaty of Sèvres, and it took Venizelos and Lloyd George's diplomatic abilities stretched to the limit to get the Italians to go back and respect that agreement, and eventually the treaty was signed. But by that time, Italy was already aiding the Turkish nationalist movement, and the Italians were fomenting Turkish reaction against the Greek presence in Asia Minor. And there were even clashes between Italian and Greek troops. So the prospects were not so bright, despite all the agreements and the Treaty of the Sèvres. But Venizelos' hope was that even if all the other powers abandoned Greece, Britain would still stand by him, by Venizelos' Greece. Of course, he never expected that the Greeks themselves would vote him out of office within a couple of months. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Stefanidis, for your brief but very interesting intervention. Again, with signs of the complexity of regional issues and the role of various powers and countries historically in this whole region. We now move on to Professor Ploumidis, who is going to speak to us on the anti-Greek pogrom of 1914 and Greece's roadmap to Asia Minor.
Okay. For my part, a few remarks on Greece's roadmap to Asia Minor. Greece's entanglement in Asia Minor, that is Asiatic Turkey, has certainly been overshadowed by the country's involvement in the First World War. However, the violent events that preceded the eruption of the Great War played a major role in Greece's decision to launch a military campaign there. In particular, an anti-Greek pogrom took part in Western Asia Minor in the first half of 1914, and it was the main impulse behind Greece's Asia Minor agenda. The atrocities against the Greek Orthodox started in January in the village of Andrianople, that is in Turkish Thrace, and spilled over into the village of Bursa and Smyrna in April. The violence amounted to what we could call today ethnic cleansing. It entailed intimidation, boycotting, pillaging, starvation, rapes, firing at civilians, and random murders. The aim of the persecutors, obviously, was the expulsion of the Greek Orthodox from these strategic areas of Western Anatolia through fear and terror. As a result, in late spring of 1914, the islands of Chios and Mytilene, as well as the city of Salonika, were literally flooded with 150 to 200,000 refugees, according to present-day scholarly estimates. Even though the raiders had no orders to kill, in certain cases, such as in the villages of Basque and Serekui, wherein the local Christians offered armed resistance, the anti-Greek movement went out of hand and inflicted lethal blows to the victims. In both cases of Basque and Serekui, a score of 100 local men were shot dead by the intruders. The most sorrowful instance of violence was the township of Old Phokia, Focha Iadenitas, the Turks called it at the time, a small settlement northwest of Smyrna of 6,000, where over 100 to 200 inhabitants were killed by the invaders. The destruction of Phokia has been witnessed by the French archaeologist Félix Sartiot, who happened to be excavating there once more, when the attack took suddenly place there on the 13th of June, 1914. Félix Sartiot extensively documented his experience in the renowned journal Revue de Deux Mondes and in a paper presented to the French Geographical Society in February 1918. The French archaeologist identified several of the perpetrators. They were local Muslims whom he had employed in his excavations in the immediate previous years. The French scholar proved himself to be also a philanthropist. By raising the French flag on his premises, he managed to offer safe refuge to several victims. He also left an invaluable testimony since he photographed the ruins of Phokia in the aftermath of the pogrom. Sartios's visual material was discovered by chance many years later by a Greek collector, Haris Yakoumis, and 200 of his photos were published in a bilingual album in 2008. This is the front cover of this album, published in Athens and Paris in 2008 with the funding of the Rizarios Ecclesiastical Foundation. A special reference to the slaughter and pillaging of Phokia was also made by George Horton, the US Consul General in Smyrna, in his account of the deplorable events titled The Blight of Asia and published in New York in 1926. Therein, The American diplomat identifies the pogrom as a systematic extermination of Christian populations by Mohammedans. In addition to Félix Sartiot and George Horton, the anti-Greek pogrom of 1914 is also well documented in the reports of the dragomans, that is, the translators, in the reports of the dragomans of the embassies of the 6 great powers in Constantinople. In the aftermath of the pogrom, the dragomans of the great powers were collectively commissioned to visit the sites of sorrow and to report on the atrocities. On the 2nd of July, 1914, the dragoman of the British Embassy, a certain W.D.W. Matthews, reported to his superior, to Ambassador Sir Louis Mallet, a really prominent and renowned British diplomat, that based on what he had seen in the localities of Bursa and Smyrna, he had arrived to the conclusion that, quotation marks, the anti-Greek movement was directly inspired by the central government and encouraged by the provincial authorities, end of quotes. And Matthews noted also that the Greeks are in such a state of panic that they all desire to emigrate. All in all, the mission of the young Turkish government was accomplished. Today, his researchers describe the ethnic cleansing of Aegean Greeks as a case of violent Turkification aimed at the homogenization of the Ottoman Empire. Here I have one of the 2 papers published in 2008 in the Journal of Genocide Research, a journal that belongs to Routledge Publishers and is under the aegis of Taylor and Francis Group, wherein in page 47 there's a special reference to the massacre of Phokia as one of the worst attacks of this anti-Greek campaign. Inevitably, the forced exodus of the Aegean Greeks brought Greece and Turkey to the brink of war. On the 29th of May, 1914, a really symbolic day, Premier Eleftherios Venizelos threatened Turkey with war if the persecution of fellow Greeks continued any further. The Greek war threat, along with strong British and Russian demarches, forced very shortly the Turkish government to put an end to the pogrom and to restore order in Western Anatolia. However, Turkey's violent policy continued to raise concerns in Athens. In June, Greece called to the colors 3 classes of conscripts and announced naval maneuvers in the Aegean. In mid-August 1914, Eleftherios Venizelos stated in Parliament that the complete destruction of Asia Minor Hellenism was imminent. Thereupon, he openly called for an alliance with the 2 Western powers, meaning Britain and France. In fact, the Asia Minor issue was the main driving force behind Greece's entry into the First World War. Later that same month of August 1914, Venizelos submitted his first pro-war memorandum to King Constantine. Therein, Venizelos' main argument for an alliance with the Entente was the urgent need to rescue and to secure the future of the Greek element in Turkey, as well as to achieve the repatriation of those expelled from there in the previous months. The relapse of the anti-Greek pogrom in late 1914 strengthened Venizelos' determination to approach the Entente powers. In late December 1914, the Greek statesman was vehemently targeted in Parliament as well as by the press for his diplomatic failures, setbacks, inertia, passivity, and incapacity to defend the national prestige towards Turkey. Seizing this opportunity, Venizelos took the initiative to meet Sir Francis Eliot, the head of the British legation in Athens at the time and the doyen of the diplomatic corps in Athens. The meeting between the 2 men took place on Christmas Eve, 1914. There, Venizelos formally expressed his country's willingness to declare war on Germany and its allies in return for territorial concessions in Asia Minor. All in all, Greece's roadmap to Asia Minor had already been drawn up and securely fastened by the end of 1914. That's all for my part for now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Ploumidis, for a very interesting intervention, shedding some light on one of the less widely known among the wider public reasons for Greece's policy considerations that led to developments over the First World War and later in the Asia Minor campaign. Now, Dr. Sotiris Rizas will make his intervention on the national schism and Greece's policy on Asia Minor.
Thank you very much, Christos. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for the invitation and the opportunity to be here. As Greece's territorial expansion towards the Asia Minor was introduced in the agenda of the Anglo-Greek talks in January 1915, the possibility of an Anatolian campaign and the Greek strategic thinking on it was linked with the national schism. Venizelos' faith in the feasibility of this project was countered by the analysis and the underlying assumptions of the anti-Venizelist bloc, which was in the process of consolidation after Venizelos' resignation in February 1915. Ioannis Metaxas provided a strategic rationale for the opposition to an Asia Minor engagement. Greece did not possess the military capability to overcome Turkey's resistance and occupy eventually the Asia Minor. Demographically, the Greeks were concentrated along the Aegean coastal line, whereas the Greek army had to strike deep in the Anatolian heartland if it wished to enforce the terms of a political settlement upon the Turks. On top of that, a psychological inclination of the crown towards Constantinople was discernible in royalist thinking, but since this was not a realizable policy due to Russia's participation in the Entente and the British commitment to a Russian presence in Constantinople and the Straits, the crown and the emergent anti-Venizelism displayed indifference over the campaign against the Dardanelles and the promised territorial gains in Asia Minor. Of course, we understand that the unspoken assumption of anti-Venizelist thinking was the preservation of Greek neutrality that worked favorably to the strategy of the Central Powers. There was no unanimous rejection of the Ionian vision amongst anti-Venizelism due to its lack of cohesion, as this bloc owed its unity mostly to the crown and not to the predilections of its constituent parts. In 1916, Nikolaos Stratos, one of the distinguished personalities of the anti-Venizelist camp, would represent Smyrna and Asia Minor as a second pillar of Greek imperialism, what he called in Greek του ελληνικού αυτοκρατορισμού. Overall, anti-Venizelism retained a stance marked by opposition or reservation towards the Asia Minor engagement that was not deprived, though, from an opportunistic ambiguity. This stance was amplified in the spring of 1919 at the time of the Greek army's landing on Smyrna. A young diplomat, Alexandros Rizos Rangavis, was in doubt of the solidity of Allied support to Venizelos and was of the opinion that the Italians would regain their influence and therefore their position in Asia Minor. He was also critical of the strategic prioritization of Venizelos, questioning the future of Thrace. He also pointed out that there were unforeseeable military and economic risks in the undertaking of the Asia Minor campaign. Ion Dragoumis, although not opposed in principle to Greece's territorial expansion towards the Asia Minor Peninsula, understood that a part of Greek territorial claims might not be realizable. He proposed the granting of self-government or local autonomy to the Greek communities who would remain within the territory of a Turkish national state that would succeed the now defunct Ottoman Empire. This was the essence of a memorandum he sent to the Paris Peace Conference while in exile in Charistos in August 1919. In November 19, Dimitrios Gounaris, the most distinguished of the leaders of the anti-Venizelist bloc, was critical of Venizelos' policy on Asia Minor and his identification with the Entente, as a result of which Greece encountered the loss of life and money. His priority was the stabilization of anti-Venizelism in power once the opposition parties would prevail in an election still to be conducted. His opposition to the Asia Minor campaign was tactical, even opportunistic, as it became evident by his volte-face in May 1920. The announcement then of the Allied terms for the conclusion of the peace treaty with the Ottoman Empire seemed to vindicate Venizelos' policy. Greece was granted the administration of Smyrna and its hinterland for a period of 5 years. This settlement would be ratified by a referendum, which no one was really in doubt that the ballot would favor Greek sovereignty. In this instance, Ioannis felt that the opposition had to emphasize to the Allies that Greece, led by anti-Venizelism, would be a reliable alliant partner. Ioannis prioritized the victory of his coalition in the coming election, and the restoration of liberties should be the keystone of anti-Venizelist platform. In the realm of foreign policy, nonetheless, Ioannis expected that Greece would consider the interests of the great powers, Britain in particular. The anti-Venizelist governments should not, at any rate, be found in opposition to British interests. The Greeks had to prove their maturity and their ability to determine their domestic political situation. To achieve this, they had to align their foreign policy with the British, so that a rift with Entente was avoided. Ioannis apparently had the precedent of 1917 in mind. Metaxas was the only anti-Venizelist of some importance who retained his reservations on Asia Minor campaign at the time. In early July 20, Metaxas was of the opinion that the treaty to be concluded in Sèvres was not the end of the Eastern question, but an agreement between Greece and the Allies, which had to be concluded before Greece's entry into the war. It fell to the Greek shoulders, Metaxas pointed out, to enforce the treaty with British support in doubt and the abstention or the opposition of the French and the Italians. Metaxas was at a loss when he had understood that Ioannis was now favorably disposed towards the Greek landing on Smyrna. The victory of anti-Venizelism on November 1, 1920, presented the political and the strategic problem for Venizelos' successors. Could they surmount the unwillingness of their electorate to support the prolongation of the war effort, and specifically the undertaking of a campaign towards the heart of Anatolia? Staff work had already laid the ground for this since August 1920. Ioannis and his associates were not in doubt, after the London Conference in early 1921, that withdrawal from Asia Minor would mean the loss of Eastern Thrace as well. It was an engagement from which there could be no escape. Politically, the anti-Venizelist governments were able to mobilize the army and retain political support, utilizing the symbolic powers of the crown, claiming that the campaign would not last for long and would be victorious. A degree of tolerance of draft dodgers retained some political stability at home, whilst the stalemate on the front line during the winter of 1921-1922 undermined terminally Greece's engagement in Asia Minor. Still, however resourceful or badly conceived as it was the restoration of Constantine, the policy of the anti-Venizelist coalitions, it could not resolve the key strategic flaw of an engagement that went beyond the political, diplomatic, economic, and military capabilities of the Greek state. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rizas, for yet another interesting intervention that shed light on the difficulties of pursuing a policy that was not publicly supported before in actual practice, something that readers of the copies of Kathimerini volumes of the period have the opportunity to read about nowadays. And of course, speaking of Kathimerini, I give the floor to Mr. Costas Iordanidis, who will speak to us on the Kathimerini founder and editor Georgios Vlachos and Eleftherios Venizelos.
Thank you very much, Christos. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. The years preceding, during, and after the Great War were exceptional times, and those who were directly involved or played a significant role in public life in this period were exceptional men, or at least so we think today. One of them was Eleftherios Venizelos, the notorious leader of the Greek Liberal Party, a very controversial politician idolized by his followers and most of his former opponents, but still despised by a rather small number of Greek conservatives. I've been asked to make a brief presentation on George Vlachos, the publisher and editor-in-chief of Kathimerini, and on his relations with Venizelos. Vlachos was not a journalist in the conventional sense of the word. He was a fighter and a very skillful writer. He mastered the Greek language far better than any journalist of his time. As a writer, he was more like the English pamphleteers during the War of the Spanish Succession. Vlachos' lengthy articles appeared almost every day on the front page of his newspaper. And I think it is fair to say that all of his articles strongly criticize Venizelos' domestic and foreign policy. The target of his relentless criticism was not an eminent political or military leader, but a newcomer from Crete, a revolutionary anti-monarchist whose radicalism threatened not only the political stability of Greece, but also its territorial acquisitions in the north after the two Balkan Wars. Vlachos' own family was deeply rooted in the history of the modern Greek state. His grandfather Stavros, born in Athens in 1802, took part in the Greek War of Independence. He was a member of the Guard of Athens and a defender of the fortress of the city. He provided arms and supplies to the Greek fighters. In 1826, during the siege of Athens by Kutahi Pasha, Stavros Vlachos, as a member of the Council of Elders of the city of Athens, transferred the goods of his family warehouse to the public warehouses. In 1843, he was elected a member of the first National Assembly that drafted the first constitution of this country. George Vlachos' father, Angelos Vlachos, was a prize-winning man of letters and a playwright who was elected in 1885 deputy of the Attica constituency, representing the party of Harillos Trikoupis. When Trikoupis became prime minister, Angelos Vlachos was appointed ambassador in Berlin. He was recalled to Athens in 1890 when Greece became bankrupt and the government closed its embassies in Europe. Angelos Vlachos was ambassador in Berlin when Crown Prince of Greece Constantine married Princess Sophia, the sister of German Emperor Wilhelm. To mark the occasion, Otto von Bismarck, the then German foreign minister, presented to Angelos Vlachos with the gift of a desk. It was on this desk that George Vlachos was to write his daily articles until his death. In contrast to George Vlachos, Eleftherios Venizelos came from an absolutely different world. He was the son of a merchant of modest means from Crete. Yet this rather shabby-looking man in his heavy overcoat with a long shawl wrapped around his neck was a strong-willed upstart, full of energy and unlimited ambition. Besides the social distance separating the two men, the Athenian establishment to which Vlachos undoubtedly belonged did not look kindly on Venizelos. For them, he was a troublemaker, an agitator of the populace, and a dangerous rebel. He was also guilty in their eyes for having deviously undermined the authority of Prince George when the latter was High Commissioner in Crete. The fact that Venizelos enjoyed full support of the rebellious military officers who had turned against King George and his sons, blaming them for the defeat of the Greek army in 1897, only increased the mistrust of the conservatives towards him. When Venizelos, with the support of his Entente allies, came to power once more, Vlachos was exiled to Skyros and then to Skopelos. The reason for this treatment was his opposition to Venizelos' policies, which he had expressed in a series of articles published in various magazines and newspapers. Returning to Athens in 1918, Vlachos was determined to quit journalism and start a peaceful life with his family. His intention was to get his job back in the National Bank of Greece, where he had been appointed in 1904. His application was rejected by the Prime Minister, or at least so he was informed by a friend of his closely connected with the Liberal Party, who tried to act as a mediator. It was then that he decided to proceed with the publication of a newspaper. Lacking the necessary financial means, he put his wife's house in Patrician Street on sale. The offices of the newspaper, namely Kathimerini, were in 57 Socrates Street, where he lived with his family. He bought a second-hand printing machine and set it up in his garden. The first issue of his newspaper appeared on the 15th of September, 1919, under severe censorship. Several paragraphs of his article were crossed out by the censors, and the scars of this brutal intervention were strikingly evident, since the newspaper circulated with blank spaces on its front page. When in 1932, the two men finally met for the first and last time in Paris in the Hotel Le Crillon, Venizelos claimed that he had never been told that Vlachos wanted to return to his former job in the bank. According to Vlachos' daughter, Helen, the meeting of the two sworn political enemies ran very smoothly. Venizelos even asked Vlachos to join him for a dinner, but he declined the offer. It was too late to start a new friendship. The rest is history, and a very sad one. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Iordanidis. With your knowledge of the Greek media world, present and past, is unsurpassable. Thank you very much. That's very interesting. Before moving to opening the floor to questions, and I'm reminding our friends here who are joining us online that they can use the chat box for any points or questions they might want to make. I would like to invite the speaker and our discussants, whether they have any remark on what we've heard so far, any comments they would like to make, any additions. Okay. Professor Stefanidis, then Professor Ploumidis.
I have a query for the ambassador, Sir Michael. In April and May, 1919, the British Foreign Office, especially Sir Eyre Crowe, Nicholson, and Toynbee, discussed the scenario of giving Greece Eastern Thrace and Constantinople and drawing the frontier between Greece and Turkey along the Sea of Marmara. So, in a way, dividing Europe from Asia for good, as they put it. And they were about to make this proposal clear to the Americans. Venizelos had, in the meantime, rejected it when he was approached by Nicholson. So before they were able to put it to the Americans, the three great men at the Paris Peace Conference invited the Greeks to send troops to Smyrna. So that plan was killed. Having followed through Petsali's work this episode, I have not come across any objections within the British cabinet on the part of Edwin Montagu or anyone else. So could you please enlighten us about this scenario, whether it had, I mean, by the time they proposed it, it seemed that the British cabinet would agree to it. They had the consent of Balfour and Lloyd George.
Well, it's rather difficult to comment because it didn't happen. And I think probably the reason is that it got carried away in what I mentioned in my talk, the great rush of events. You know, Nicholson had a very good relationship with Venizelos. They talked all the time. They went to dinner together and so on. But when it came to the point, it wasn't Nicholson who made the important decisions. He was an advisor, and what mattered more was Lloyd George and his view of what should be done. So I don't know exactly the sequence of events, and I think it is an interesting speculation, as I sort of hinted at the end of my talk, as to what would have happened if Greece had adopted such a line. Perhaps everything would have been different. How will we ever know? We never will. I mean, that's the mystery of history, that it happens and you can't pull the clock back or and rerun. So I don't know the answer.
Professor Ploumidis.
Two questions to Sir Michael, if I may.
Yeah.
One more general, one more specific. In your opinion, was Lloyd George in a position, or did he have the power or the will to save the Treaty of Sevres from revision and have it ratified by the Houses? The second question is, in your opinion, and as far as I can understand from your path-breaking book, which reasons, was it the external or the internal political reasons that can explain this consent of Britain to the revision of this peace treaty? Certainly, Churchill swayed a big influence in this coalition, Lloyd George government. He was the voice of the army. The backdrop of his stance towards the Treaty of Sevres was the British military, who obviously saw Turkey as a more useful ally in the long term than the small Greek army. However, I think, and you may agree or disagree with me, that the exigency to keep a common front with France and to save the Anglo-French Entente, and therefore to save peace in Europe, outweighed any home politics and balances within Lloyd George's cabinet.
Yeah, I agree with that last point. I think that's right. There were other issues as well as Franco-British cooperation, which was very difficult at that period, as so often. What about now? Yeah, and so that did play an important role with Lloyd George. I don't know if he could have muscled his way through and got the Treaty of Sevres ratified, but I doubt it, because it was already falling to bits. And the ratification would have brought to the surface the difficulties in the treaty and the difficulty in getting it ratified. So I think the answer to that is probably no, he couldn't have done it. External or internal, or, I wasn't sure of the question.
Which reasons outweighed the final stance, the negative stance of Britain and its concern for its decision to have the Treaty of Sevres revised
Yeah.
at the very end.
Well, I think it was necessity, and one has to bear in mind the famous Marquis of Curzon at this point. He was an extraordinary man, as was Lloyd George, but in a totally different way. And Curzon was beavering away, trying to find a way through the difficulties which faced Britain when they held these meetings in 1921, and failing, because by that time Kemal, who was, I suppose, a bit of a gambler like Venizelos, Kemal was not prepared to give way at all. And so this is also an answer to the question of ratifying the Treaty of Sevres. It became impossible because of Kemal, I think. And Curzon struggled and struggled and struggled, and he wanted to end up as Prime Minister, and he failed. But he did have his moment at Lausanne in putting the bricks which had fallen in shambles together again. So he was not a negligible figure. And Lloyd George, although Lloyd George, as I mentioned, humiliated him and treated him very badly, sometimes in front of other ministers, which is never a good thing to do. Never. But it's always happening. And Curzon was a bit demoralized by all this. Poor man. And then on top of all that, he succeeds with Lausanne, that's great. And then his chance comes, and he takes a train to London thinking he's going to be Prime Minister. And it doesn't happen. Tragic end. Yeah.
Everybody had his way, though.
Yes.
Garrison at the end.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. I'll now open the floor to questions by the public. Mr. Ioannis. Yes, I don't know how. I'm sure.
I want to share a testimony with you, which is very rare. Probably you don't know about it. I discovered it when I was a student in England at Trinity College Library. Yeah, sorry. I discovered it in the college library. There were some old issues of the Literary Review. This was a magazine published by Ezra Pound. He was the editor. And in the Literary Review of 1924, I found pieces written by Ernest Hemingway, who was the journalist at the time for the Toronto Star. And he wrote pieces on Asia Minor and the catastrophe, but he also wrote a very short poem, which I had translated in Greek, but when you try to find something, you never find it. And I was supposed to bring the book to you, but I would like to read to you this very short poem, because he is an observer, and he makes very funny comments about Kemal, Venizelos, Lord Curzon, and the poem ends actually with the Greek patriarch. So, since I couldn't find the book, I have it here. He also mentions some, the ambassadors, the Japanese ambassador, the Soviet Commissar for Foreign Affairs. So, and also he mentions the Armenians. So it's after the Treaty of Lausanne. And the title of the poem is, "They all made peace. What is peace? All of the Turks are gentlemen, and Ismet Pasha is a little deaf. But the Armenians, how about the Armenians? Well, the Armenians. This thing about the deaf is that when he was negotiating with Curzon, every time he didn't want to listen to Curzon, he would take all his hearing aid, and he was pretending to be deaf. Yeah. Lord Curzon likes young boys. So does Chicherin. So does Mustafa Kemal. He's good looking too. His eyes are too close together, but he makes war. That is the way he is. Lord Curzon does not love Chicherin, not at all. His beard trickles and his hands are cold. He thinks all the time. Lord Curzon thinks too, but he's much taller and goes to St. Moritz. Mr. Child does not wear a hat. He was the American ambassador to Paris. Baron Hayashi, the Japanese ambassador, gets in and out of the automobile. Monsieur Barrère gets telegrams, so does Marquis Garoni. His telegrams come on motorcycles from Mussolini in capital. Mussolini has nigger eyes and a bodyguard and has his picture taken reading a book upside down. Mussolini is wonderful. Read the Daily Mail. I used to know Mussolini. Nobody likes him then. Even I didn't like him. He was a bad character. Ask Monsieur Barrière. We all drink cocktails. It's too early to have a cocktail. How about a drink, George? Come on, and we'll have a cocktail, Admiral. Just time before lunch. Well, what if we do? Not too dry. Well, what do you boys know this morning? Oh, they're shrewd, they're shrewd. Mr. Stabulinsky walks up the hill and down the hill. Don't talk about Monsieur Venizelos. He's wicked. You can see it. His beard shows it. Mr. Child is not wicked. Mrs. Child has flat breasts, and Mrs. Child is an idealist and wrote Harding's campaign speeches and calls Senator Beveridge Al. You know me, Al. Lincoln Stephen is with Child. The big C makes the joke easy. Then there is Mosul and the Greek patriarch. What about the Greek patriarch?
That's good.
Thank you, Mr. Lovianos. Questions? Other questions? Thank you. Okay. A question from the public. There has been a lot of public discussion, also through the columns of Kathimerini, on whether Venizelos' decision to accept the mandate for Smyrna was a mistake, whether this or that move by the Greek army in Asia Minor was mistaken, whether the decision not to pull out earlier was a mistake, etc. From the point of view of securing a more stable Greek-Turkish relationship for the future, was the Allies' decision to give the mandate to Greece a mistake in the first place?
Yes.
I think Sir Michael answered that in the beginning, but it's a rhetorical question. Okay. Yeah.
I think so.
Any other questions? Okay. Thank you very much. We can continue our discussion and questions and points over a drink at the garden. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you to all our participants and discussants. Thank you.